Well, I think that probably is a long enough wait. I think we're probably live. Welcome. I'm Claire Moon. This is another office hour. I'm an astrologer, so this is basically my once monthly Q&A where if you too enjoy astrology, you can come and ask me questions or talks to monk yourself in the chat, which is going to be over to the right-hand side of your screen. That's another really fun thing about this. I didn't announce this, partially because I don't have my shit together. I am sick, so we'll see how this goes. It's not COVID this time, so that's the important part. I didn't even announce this. I didn't even do a call for questions because I actually have kind of a backlog of things that I've been meaning to go over for a long time. Less questions. I do have one question from someone that actually fell through the cracks. So I think today is going to be more of a Mercury retrograde. Let's tie up some loose ends. I'm going to tie up a lot of loose ends in my own Q&A kind of document. So, it's kind of a potpourri. If you're coming in at any point today, just throw a question in the chat if you have one. But otherwise, I do have one listener question from Megator, which she asked way back in May, or they asked way back in May. And I'm so sorry. Their name is Megan, I believe. And I'm sorry, Megan, but I'm going to answer your question today. And what was the question? It was basically, they had a few really good comments, a few points that they made on some other notes, which I'm not going to get into. But they did ask about Chiron. And so I'm going to do a little spiel on Chiron today. I'm probably going to talk a little bit about the Virgo new moon just because we're here and it's happening like right now. But yeah, other than that, I might just go through my list of random kind of thoughts and little topics that I had. There is no one here, so I'm just going to take a little moment with my cider with chai in it, which is awesome. If you're familiar with me, I fuck with this. So I think that's the one F-bomb I get. I think I get to say one F-bomb and then I lose money or something. I don't know how it works. Yeah. So 12th house year. Wow, that's happening. For those of you who are privy to annual profections, that is a technique that it basically highlights a planet for the year, but it also highlights a slew of house topics for whatever house is highlighted. And this year, I am in a year that highlights Saturn and the 12th house. And I have gotten sick so many times. I knew that was a possibility just because the 12th and the 6th houses are where illness and disease live. But yeah, it's been this is probably random infection number 6 or 7. And I'm not exaggerating. There's just been so many little things. So that's been very 12th housey. That is checking out, and we are checking that box, not to scare anyone, but more to validate that is a thing and that is real. Hello, Nikki Nice. Welcome back. It's good to see you. It's always good to see a familiar face. I was just going to go on a thing about Chiron. So let's do that. Let's do that. And then I'll get to my list. And of course, we're talking about lists because it's Virgo. It's Virgo day, super Virgo day. So let's talk about Chiron. Right now, they're in Aries. And we discovered Chiron, what was it, back in the 70s? I'm not sure, but we haven't even been watching it for a whole time around, which takes about 50 some years. So we're getting an idea, empirically speaking, kind of still who Chiron is, but we can, of course, rely on myth for this. We can rely on our own lived experience of Chiron. And so the question that Megator asked was basically, what is Chiron about? How do we deal with, they had mentioned aspects to Chiron, basically Chiron primer. So let's get into that. I'm going to do a few buckets of topics for Chiron. So one of them is the teacher mentor set of archetypes that go along with Chiron. There's also the healer type bucket of things. And then there's also just kind of the pain, wound, thorn in the paw that is Chiron. That is kind of ouchy. That's why people we complain. I complain about Chiron. I will never forget. I adore this moment when Chris Brennan said that we should just blow up Chiron, and I completely agree. Sorry, sorry. I mean, no disrespect, but like, it's not always the best feeling kind of transit. Even when we're on more of the healing part of a Chiron situation in our natal chart or during a transit, to me, the analogy that I use is like when a scab is healing and it gets itchy around the edges. Like that type of healing where things are getting pulled on and it's kind of uncomfortable. That's the vibe of when Chiron healing is happening. I personally have noticed, especially like last spring. So I'm just going to actually bring it up because it was kind of an interesting time. We had both Venus and Jupiter in Aries this last spring, 2023. And they were with Chiron for a moment. Oh, I went too far. Yeah, they were with Chiron for a moment. And wow, I don't know if anybody else can think back to the Aries part of your chart and maybe think back to like, I don't know, the beginning of March, the first week of March, and think about what was really maybe healing or helpful that was happening there in the Aries part of your chart. That for me was a lot of things that had to do with my voice because it's in my third house, teaching, learning, things that I was excited about, as a teacher and as a student. Also just like romantic stuff, a lot of healing with that, with just Venus being involved. So within all of that awesomeness though, that I was well aware of that was going on at the time, I was like, oh yeah, this is definitely what that's about. Like, as we do when we're watching transits. There were some painful little bits about it because especially when it came to like a lot of the, I think sometimes when things get better, we can look back and we can feel relieved, but we look back and we're like, damn, that was gnarly. Or we can look back and be like, yeah, that was really ouchy. And we can almost get kind of that either just remembering and having that kind of be ouchy or, any manner of the ouchiness that can go along with healing. I guess I'll just leave it at that because there's just so many ways that can come out. So that's one thing with Chiron is the healing. Now, being wounded, we all got one, right? At least we all have a Chiron somewhere. And wherever it is in our birth chart can describe where we might interact with these themes of woundedness or, maybe in the myth, which I'll talk about. I'm not going to leave the myth without that being said. But there's this idea that Chiron did not heal from their wounds. And so I think this question comes up of like, are these pains overcomable? Can we overcome them? Or, is this always going to be this ouchy thing in my birth chart in that house, with those topics, especially. And I think the answer is that we can overcome plenty with it. I don't know. It probably depends on the chart and the person, but I think it is definitely possible to get on the other side of some of these wounds and troubles. Now, that being said, when we do end up on the other side of it, we can end up also in kind of teacher mentor roles, because when we think about what it is to struggle with something or have something that's difficult recurringly over life, we tend to be forced to figure it out. We tend to be forced to have to reckon with it. And we become kind of little experts in that area sometimes. So I'm just going to say the myth, because maybe this will make a lot more sense if I just do that first. So I always do the drunk history version of these things because I'm just not a skilled, storyteller. But anyway, Chiron was a centaur. And when they were born, they were rejected essentially by their family. And so already just the beginning of the story of Chiron, we get this deep pain and rejection that happens. And this kind of otherness, like they other Chiron, and because he wasn't accepted as who he was, as like a centaur instead of like a human. So he goes off and he's, I don't know the details between him having that experience and then ending up in a cave somewhere probably, or somewhere where he could take in other people who had likewise maybe been rejected or harmed in some way, or disenfranchised in some way, as far as I can remember the vibe of the story. It's basically Chiron was a helper to those people who had challenges, kind of similar to the way that he had challenges. So there is that aspect of like, yeah, there was this hard thing, and then I end up being on the other side of it, someone who can help others with that hard thing, which, I mean, yeah, kind of a womp womp silver lining, like, but we do see that happen so much. I think it's just a natural progression of events. That's just how it goes. If you struggle with something enough, you're going to keep working on it, and you're going to get better at it, and you're going to pick up some skills along the way. So, my version in my chart, just using myself as an example, I have Chiron in the 5th. So you can automatically kind of figure out, excuse me, what types of topics might be involved in my little ouchy thorn in my paw that, every 5 steps or every 5 years or whatever, it gets triggered by stuff in the chart. It's like stepping on that thorn and being like, oh yeah, that's right, that's still there. But with the romantic challenge, I have also, I with all of that struggle, and I have the TED Talks, the podcasts, the books, the courses, the investment in my time, my money, my emotional labor that I put into for decades of trying to figure out how the F to romance, right? So now I do. And now I have a bunch of great resources. If you're ever having romantic troubles, get a reading with Claire Moon, because learn from all of my mistakes. Oh my God, you can save so much time and money. But anyway, that's my Chiron thing. And I'm only 35. So this is the other thing about Chiron too, is that it takes, like, let's just see. It takes like 50 years. Let's see when. Yeah, it takes about 50 and some change years for Chiron to get around. I don't think you have to wait that whole cycle to come out on the other side of the challenge, to come out being knowledgeable or helpful to others in that challenge. I see plenty of people in our 30s who are like, yep, we're figuring it out, and we are able to use some of these tools for some kind of constructive purpose. But yeah, there is that healer archetype in there, right? That whole kind of chestnut of what it means to be a healer. And there's so many philosophical notions about what it means to be a healer, and, opinions about what that means. The people have all their, unique kind of criteria or rubrics for what it means to be a healer. Well, in this particular camp, one of the things is like, you have to go through the shit in order to be that healer. That's kind of my opinion on it. Now, I think there's an assumption in there that just because you've been through stuff that's difficult means that you have also transmuted it and or are able to transmit that learning to someone else. That's not a guarantee. So that's the thing that I personally feel with Chiron, is that there are no guarantees. Just because you have Chiron in a place does not mean that you are guaranteed to become a healer in that area. I mean, hell, if I'm being real dark, I don't even think it's guaranteed that we're going to heal ourselves in that area. Maybe some of that Chiron story does ring true, and the ending is pretty sad because he just makes a deal to basically end his life and to be a mortal person so he can just die, basically. So yeah, like, that's pretty depressing, but I think it's also very realistic. Also to note that, in this day and age, and where does, I had a motivation for saying that. And the motivation for bringing that little piece up, that there's no guarantees, is that when I hear a lot of other astrology enthusiasts, people who talk about astrology, talk about Chiron, there is a little bit of presumptuousness I hear, in that they think, oh, just because I experienced a hard thing means that I should, help others through it, or, there's like some assumptions made. So I don't know. I don't think that's the case, but I'm going to leave it at that. I think, so then looking at, okay, we can look at the house that it's in our natal chart, or the house that it's in our chart by transit. So, right now it's in Aries. So what house is Aries for you? But also, looking at this in terms of aspects from other stuff. So let's pretend that this is a person, and there's a Pisces rising person here, and they've got Chiron in the 2nd house. Maybe they got some challenges around resources, getting their needs met. any of that myriad second house money resources thing, which is such a huge, huge, very nuanced actually topic that I'm not going to get into. But let's just say this is where the trouble is. And we got to look, okay, well, what other planets are helping Chiron potentially? What other planets are making it more difficult for Chiron? And so for that, okay, I got Chiron here in the second. Well, what I can see here is that Saturn is not in communication, at least by any kind of major aspect. So that is something that Chiron does not have to deal with, which is great because apparently this is a night chart. We do have an opposition with Mars. So we could talk about, maybe how Mars is adding a bit more challenge or tension to this process's journey that Chiron is trying to go through. Then we can see Venus is potentially helping. So, we're not getting help from Jupiter, but we are getting some help from Venus. So then this person would look in their sixth house and maybe look at Venusian topics like relationship, expression, art, all of those Venusian things, values, love, yum-yums, and sixth house things. How can that area of life, how can those archetypes help you with your Chiron probs, So that's how I work into Chiron, and where in the chart can we look for assistance? Where do we know is not part of this equation as much? So like, I wouldn't then think that Saturn had much to do with the Chiron story as much, because they're just not that connected in this chart. So I hope that gives a good jumping off point for Chiron. I was introduced to Chiron by Adam Sommer of Holes to Heavens. Adam, he had this, and I think he still does, at least I don't know if he still has it for Chiron, but he has like this 3-package deal of consults with him, of sessions with him, where he goes over everything Chiron related. So I had an hour where he just taught me the myth of Chiron, which is really sad. Hopefully he never sees this, because I totally butchered the myth, even though I had a beautiful teacher. But there's the myth of it, and then, understanding it in the birth chart and what that challenge is, and then the solutions to it, and kind of, okay, well, here is this thing. How do we want to move forward with that? I think, if we can look at Chiron as, I don't know, it's a challenge with a silver lining. I think I think that's a reasonable way to look at it. All right, let's see if anybody has any questions or concerns. Okay, Nikki has a Chiron in the second house, but yours is in Leo. So yeah, you probably, when I was saying those things, maybe you were having little, fires in your brain. You're like, yep, that's yes. Then there's a question, does it interact with aspects and all that fun? Yes, it does. Yep. Yeah, so definitely it is an asteroid. I left out, I'm doing this totally backwards order. Happy Mercury station, everyone. It's an asteroid, right? I'm pretty sure it is. And there's a bunch of asteroids. Chiron, where are they? They're between Saturn and Uranus, I believe, aren't they? I'm going to just look it up real quick here. I should have done it before. Chiron in the solar system. Yeah, eccentric orbit with a period of 50.45 years. So when I said 50 and some change, it's like barely any change. Eccentric orbit that crosses that of Saturn and passes just inside that of Uranus. So then I like to think about, astronomically too, what it means for a planet to kind of be in a place. And I don't know, because there's usually some kind of correspondence there. So, God, I feel like I've heard Rick Levine talk about this. I'm sure he has, and I don't remember his thoughts at all, but I'm sure that he's talked about this idea of what it means to have Chiron in between Saturn and Uranus. But it's an interesting linkage there. I think that was probably his main point. One of them is just, when we're going from Saturn, which is kind of the bounds, the limit, when we only had visible planets, it was the last visible planet before we went off into the realm of like the fixed stars, which is a much more kind of higher spiritual place. So there was a lot of connotations too with Saturn and maybe transcendence. We don't necessarily think about Saturn when we think of spirituality, but I think it can fit in that way. And then we have Uranus, which is kind of what is beyond these limits. It is, it's chaos. It is what's beyond the order and structure. And so maybe I don't know what it is, but maybe that can be our homework assignment is thinking about, what can Chiron weave between these archetypes of order and liberation, or, limitation and freedom that we have between Saturn and Uranus. How can Chiron kind of weave in between there and bring these, bring us from one place to the other, or build a bridge between them of some kind? Maybe that's a fun thing to think about. Okay, let's see if there's anything else in the chat. Danny Brown is here. Hello, welcome. You made it live. Awesome. I have many beverages, of course. Oh, big news. This week I put this on the internet if you saw it, but you can drink applesauce with a straw. I don't know if anybody knew that. Totally unrelated to astrology. I'm a Pisces moon though, and so liquids are the jam, always have them. But yeah, so now I have this giant jug of applesauce, and I've been, tediously like a fool, putting it into a bowl and eating it with a spoon this whole time. And I can just take the whole jug out of the fridge and go right to the couch with a straw instead. Like, I'm living my best life. And these are the types of innovations that Mercury retrograde brings to us. So, and let us not forget that this beautiful trine between Mercury and Jupiter is happening, and it's going to be happening. Mercury stationing direct, and it's going to be moving into Jupiter. I forget when the exact trine is, but man, material innovation, that is what is happening over here, at least in my neck of the woods. Has anyone had any fun, I guess with the Mercury retrograde cycle? Usually I find out some technical things I missed. It fills in little gaps. Did anyone learn anything cool the last few weeks with the Mercury retrograde? You know what, Nikki Nice, I have a Saturn opposition to my Chiron as well. That I actually had to think about that today, because I've never really sat and thought about that for very long. And what I came up with that is, my Chiron is having some little issues, from time to time. And in my fifth house of self-expression, we'll just use that as an example. But Saturn's not helping. It's across the way in an opposition, and definitely putting a lot of pressure, a lot of high standards up in the place where I would be sharing my self-expression. And just it's just adding another kind of slower limitation to what I'm trying to work through. Oh, it's not helping. So yeah, that's how I feel about that. And that is an example of maybe another aspect not doing any favors necessarily. Oh, Nikki Nice, I'm so glad you enjoyed that episode. Oh, the aspects episode, the one where I had a panic attack. Oh, don't look at me. I bombed that one. I was not having a good anxiety day. So bear with it. It gets better in the second half. I loosen up a little bit. But yeah, after taking many, many deep breaths off camera. I have pretty mild anxiety stuff. I don't just throw around diagnoses too much, but it usually isn't a problem. It gets to be more of a problem when I have stage fright, which I do. I have a lot of stage fright. Anyway, maybe that's part of my Chiron. I just said, thank you. This is why we come together and talk about astrology together, because we all have little epiphanies, even me all the time. The more we kind of talk about it together, I think. And it's yeah, maybe that's another Chiron Saturn opposition thing, is stage fright. I don't know. It's across my 5th and my 11th, so it's probably involved with that. Fallen Soap is here. Hey, buddy, welcome back. posting my astrology opinions online and then DM'd me for readings. I got paid for your first astrology. Wait, you got paid for your first astrology reading? Oh my gosh, congratulations. Yay, let's all clap for clap for Fallen. They are on their way. Congratulations. That's a huge step. And I can't recommend it enough to, like, you know, there's this question, I think sometimes, especially for like the very Saturnian people and the very Virgoan people, that they have to know everything before they start giving readings. Or, you know, this honestly goes for any teaching. I think about this a lot with my practice of Buddhism as well. Like, I want to teach people about some of those concepts, but I feel like kind of a impotent teacher, being somewhat of a beginner myself. And Buddha actually addresses this directly, and I forget where, of course, but there was someone addressed it directly. I believe it was the Buddha that said it's okay. Like, if you know the beginner stuff, you can share that. There's nothing, you know, especially if you are practicing it yourself and working on it, like, and you understand it, yeah, like, go ahead. And same thing for reading for people. So if you are an aspiring astrologer, if you're working on it and you're to that point where you're like, I don't know, do I read for people or not? Just do like the most basic reading. Like, that's fine. One of my first readings, I just found out I was like a Pisces moon. And I cried because, of course, which is so stereotypical, but I have a Saturn square. I've got Saturn overcoming my moon by application within minutes, saying, no, you're not allowed to have feelings. So until an astrologer told me that I had a water moon, I had not given myself permission to cry, basically, for most of my life for a lot of things. And that alone was so big for me. And that was the most basic shit. Am I right? So don't, you know, hold yourself back when you can be out there helping people, you know, with really, honestly, like for us, you know, who are, you know, we're getting to be more intermediate, we can look at some of these things and say like, yeah, it's pretty basic, but man, still really potent. So, and the other thing too, I love that we're talking about this, because compensation, people wonder, like, you know, what should I charge, or should I charge, or whatever it is. And my vote is that we have some kind of energy exchange. So, you know, whether that's $10, $20, a barter, you know, dinner, whatever it is, if there's some kind of nice little energy exchange, which can be money, I think that's the sauce. So yeah, yay, that's awesome. Congrats. What else is going on? Oh, Lakai, hello, welcome back. Oh, you did a reading last week. And they insisted that they pay. I suggested 40. They gave, oh, nice. Holy, see? So, okay. So Lakai is giving this beautiful example of how someone wanted to really generously compensate them for their work. And I think that goes to show that maybe Lakai thinks, you know, oh, you know, it's pretty basic, you know, $40, sure. But that can be so potent and so helpful that maybe to them, they do value it that much. So, you know, of course, all within reason, and for that, you know, generous compensation, they did a big 3, the, you know, sun, moon, rising, looked at the natal chart ruler, and looked at the moon phase. I mean, bread and butter stuff. So that is like, congratulations, Lakai. Congratulations, Fallen Stuff. This is all very, very awesome. Look at us. We're doing it. So exciting. So like too, if you're in this place, oh, we're getting into shop talk. That's okay though. This is fun. I love shop talk. Websites, you know, and if you can't get a website going, which there's what's that really? Wix, Wix, that's a cheap website. But like I've seen people even, they just get like the Acuity scheduler, which is its own little software that you can get online, and they'll hook that into a link tree. The link tree is free. So I've seen people do that too, but that's a first step. But yeah, like if you're at that point, time to get a nice container. You know, I can't remember what your rising sign is, but I wonder what Saturn's doing. Man, all right. No cool Mercury retrograde stuff from Danny. Cool Pisces Saturn supermoon thing though. All right. Yeah, that oh, everyone was so whiny about that moon. That was funny. I was too. Well, hopefully it was fantastic. What was that for me? What was I even doing? I think I was just feeling the weight of burden of Saturn. I think that was mine, but I was very hopeful. That's what it was. Okay, so this was interesting. Let's reflect a bit because we just are having the Virgo new moon right now. This has been preceded by 2 weeks ago. No, stop. Whoop. 2 weeks ago, we had a full moon, which was, I mean, that's a different lunation cycle. So we're starting over into a new lunation cycle, but this was 2 weeks ago and we had this moon. Because the few days before we got Mars into Libra, we got Mars out of Saturn. I talked about this in my forecast. That felt great for me personally, and a lot of other people I talked to those first few days. But then as soon as the moon went into Pisces, everyone felt like a potato. It seemed people were like, I don't have any energy. It's like, yeah, I mean, Saturn and Neptune and Pisces, this has not been an energetic place. At the same time, like there was so much information coming in, like we were having all of this action in Virgo, all of this action in Pisces. And this is this axis of the little things and the big things, the kind of tedious processing and the overall dreams and hopes and visions. And I think a lot of us were being kind of seeing the mountain and being like, all right, are we going to climb that? Are we going to do this? And how would we exactly do this? And kind of maybe being sad that like, okay, well, I don't have this, but what do we have in order to climb this mountain? So I thought that was kind of a cool, that was coming into such clear vision for a lot of my clients around those couple days, and for me in a lot of ways. And I think the Pisces and Neptune being in there, it did allow for a little bit of softness and like, okay, but maybe it'll be okay, So that was kind of what I got out of it. But yeah, that was a cool moon. It was very beautiful. Hopefully astronomically, y'all got out there a couple weeks ago. I could see Saturn. I've been seeing Jupiter at night. That's been nice. You're a Taurus rising. So okay. So that means, so for all the Taurus rising, Saturn is in your 11th. And so the cute thing I love to say about Saturn in the 11th is like, it's your hopes, dreams, and aspirations, right? And Saturn is like trying to make a little container for it. Like, what do you want to grow? And then, the more gruff version of that would be like taking responsibility for your dreams. So yeah, I like it. I hope it's going great. I love also for the Taurus risings that they've got Jupiter in their first until next May. So like, yeah, the time is nigh to do things and to be protected. And like half of, too, just one last note, and then I'll go on to my next rant about whatever, on giving readings and stuff like that. And I heard Chris Brennan say this first, but I've experienced it now over the last several years, is half of our learning is didactic. Like half of our learning comes from classroom stuff, this kind of stuff, reading books. The other half of astrology learning, especially chart reading, comes from reading charts. So we all got to get out there eventually, and I think as long as we kind of have the kind of humility to understand our limits and kind of know where our expertise runs out and provide people what we can, like, ain't nothing wrong with that. That sounds fine to me. Danny made a plan to join the Coast Guard Reserve and do a slow-mo career change. That's so perfect. Holy Coast Guard, Batman. That is so Saturn. I can't even handle it. I don't know if you know this, Danny. Maybe I'm preaching to the choir, but Saturn, Lord of nautical things. We think about Saturn as shorelines and boundaries, right? A shoreline is a boundary. It's an edge. And, being in Pisces, even more, ocean, watery, coasty. So that's just like a slam dunk. And then thinking too about Saturn as the enforcement of the law, super like formal and stuff like that is that. You read things like that and you're like, tell me astrology is not real. How is astrology not real? Like, it's too perfect. All right. What else did I want to talk about today? We talked about Chiron. Let's see. One more, I guess, a little timing thing I wanted to say. And this was a little reminder I gave myself today with this new moon. Here's my little intuitive woo-woo Virgo new moon message for you. It's not about making better lists or more lists. It's about finding better ways to be at peace with the lists, because they're never ending. They're just always going to be there. So I have to remind myself of this all the time, because my trusty lists, my life would fall apart without it. But sometimes I look at it, and even if I like trick my brain and write it on a clean piece of paper, just the 2 things I got to do today, I still know there's that whole other list somewhere, some other page. And I can start to feel the weight and the burden of that. I think, too, especially with this Neptune, Saturn business, it's really possible to kind of get lost in the kind of fantasy delusion, whatever it is, of this weight of burden of the everything and the all. If we're on big paths or doing big things, or just trying to do a slow-mo course change, a slow-mo shift that can feel just really big and heavy and long. And I think Virgo can really help in that. I think sometimes, especially Earth, they have that ability to just be present with what is, taste, touch, smell, sight. What is like materially can I perceive here? And it's like, yeah, let's just be with the list. And I don't remember who said this, but it's in a sutta somewhere that says, I don't remember the sutta. It's a really nice one, but it talks about all these good qualities and nice spiritual virtues. And one of them was, it was going about your duties without burden, carrying your duties without burden, like going through what you have to do without getting identified or attached to this heavy weight of what the outcome will be, or, just the responsibility of it. So that's really, it can be kind of subtle. But I don't know. I think it's worth considering, probably, just how do I be with the list? To be peace with the list. I'm just going to do this thing, and then I'm going to do the next thing. And I don't have to make up a bunch of mental resistance about it for no reason, which is very natural. So, we got a random question. Nice. All right. Any astrology book suggestions? I see you have a few links. Yeah, I'm in search of astrology resources. Yes, I do. Dang. You should email me, because I have, I just made a thing for this. Hold up. I just made a PDF for this. That's so funny. I just put it up and I forgot about it. I made a thing of my favorite astrology resources, and I'm going to throw this in the chat here. Did that work? Heck yeah, it did. I got a list of books in here in this list, and there are links to the books. I will read them though. So You Were Born for This by Chani Nicholas. I think that one is the best for total beginners out there. I read it, a little later in my journey, and it was still helpful for me though, to be honest. Like I was like, it's a little more beginner than what I am, but heck, I even enjoyed it and loved it, but really great if you know nothing about astrology. Then the next 2 or 3 I would recommend, and these are all kind of equal in my mind. Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune by Chris Brennan, Ancient Astrology Volume 1 by Demetra George, which will inevitably get you into Volume 2. And then On the Heavenly Spheres by Ellen Avelar and Luis Ribeiro. That was my first one, On the Heavenly Spheres by Avelar and Ribeiro. And that was awesome. Very, very comprehensive, huge list of chapters. But anyway, all of those are great. Ironically, the Heavenly Spheres is such a dense bake, because it's not, I'm going to actually show you, because it's not actually that thick. I'll show you the thicknesses. On the Heavenly Spheres is this thick, but somehow they got everything in it. That's Chris Brennan's. But also the pages are bigger. And then this chunk. So yeah, they're meaty textbooks, but it's kind of a one-stop shop. Especially that, Ancient Astrology Volume 1 is very one-stop shoppy. But I think Hellenistic Astrology by Chris Brennan has a more comprehensive look at the history. And I know people tend to like, that's not all of our favorite topics, but it makes you such a better astrologer. Like, I can't even describe to you how much just really learning the history will help you. And some of it is not directly. It's not like, oh, by learning the history, you will pick up these astrology skills, but it's much more like the level of the depth of understanding when you learn the history of astrology, the level of understanding of like the philosophies, the techniques, the concepts themselves is so much deeper. It reminds me of like a broth that has been marinating or like cooking for like days, like a day, versus like canned soup if I don't learn the history. So, okay, I'm going to stop, but that's what I got for books. No, it's a great question. Stars and Gamers also likes Channy's book. On point at describing their partner's sixth house sign. That's perfect. Yeah, On the Heavenly Spheres is nice too, especially if you're into like horary astrology. I'm not, but like On the Heavenly Spheres has a bunch of like tables, speaking of lists, tons of lists of like, what signs meet are which directions and which countries and all these things. Fallen asks, I'm going through my Saturn return now. After I complete my Saturn return, will Saturn leave me alone? I never want to deal with Saturn again. I'm so sorry. Yeah. Especially if you're a night baby. Yeah, Saturn can be a little rough. So here's how I think that goes down. So let's pretend that this person is having their Saturn return. And, I would say, Saturn return, it is us kind of looking at our foundation, especially, maybe in that area of life that Saturn is returning to. But I think in general, we can just kind of say Saturn, like what over the last 27, 30 years has been constructed here for better or for worse in my life. And especially your first Saturn return, you don't have a lot of control over those foundations, a lot of your conditions growing up. We didn't choose that necessarily. So, we look at this foundation and we're like, okay, what cracks do I want to fill in? What do I not like? What do I want to replace? How do I need to reparent myself? Maybe if we're getting psychological about it. Or let's say you're doing really great, let's say Saturn's returning into your second or something and your money's fine. Then Saturn really challenges you to build up upon that and be like, hey, so you got this abundance, do something responsible with it or construct something with it. Or, maybe we reach limits potentially with it, but it doesn't it's much more kind of pushing us on to the next level if you're at that kind of place. So all of that, there's this reconstruction, deconstruction, reconstruction thing that happens over that 3-year course. And for me, of course, when Saturn returns by degree, that's going to be some of the most meaningful, intense events of the Saturn return. That does not mean that they will be reconciled, figured out, or anything. And so that's where I'm like, I'm sorry, I do have bad news a little bit. And, it depends on how you look at it. It would be bad news that no, Saturn's not going to quote unquote leave you alone. And maybe Saturn will, of course, leave that part of your chart alone. Like, in the second house example, maybe that person's money stuff will go a lot better after Saturn leaves. Like, let's be real about that. At the same time, like, depending on what events happened during your Saturn return, it may take who knows how long. Depends on how to move on from that or integrate whatever that was or whatever. What I find, or what I think, I guess, is that, if we can continue around and think about the Saturn cycle as it opens up again, then you're going to have Saturn in Aries in 2026 for 3 years. And at that point, Saturn will be in aversion to the natal Saturn. So there won't be a lot of communication happening between transiting and natal Saturn, at least by major things here for like 3 years. This to me feels like an integration phase. This feels like, okay, went through all that Saturn stuff, dealt with a lot of responsibility or, whatever the difficulty or hardship was. And now it's like, okay, the dust is settling. What is here after all of this? How do we move forward with that? Or what have I built? Okay, I'm building this thing. Let's say it's the level up version. And I'm like, all right, I'm building this thing. We're doing this thing. And now it's like, okay, we're doing this. How does this fit into my life? And then we can just keep moving it around. Saturn in a sextile to itself. Now that would be the first kind of harmonious opening phase of the new second Saturn cycle for us after our Saturn return. And this is, going to be probably more harmonious and constructive. At this point, whatever you decided to start or build or whatever happened in your Saturn return, now it's kind of moving along as it was designed, for better or for worse. It's going to do what it's doing. Also in that process of construction, if you're doing that, should go a little bit easier. So, even here, it's like, yeah, so Saturn doesn't leave us alone, but there are these cycles that happen, and the Saturn return is like a very important point. But I guess to say, Saturn's influence will wax and wane. It will kind of come in and out depending on not only just this cycle by transit, but also depending on like if you're in a Saturn perfection year. So that's another thing to consider is like, okay, if Saturn is your Lord of the Year by annual profections from either the ascendant or the sect light, you got to count around by both. If Saturn's your Lord of the Year, it's going to make them even louder, even more intense. And so if you've had a really rough year and you're like, please stop, another thing to consider is maybe your next year won't be a Saturn year, and it may be a little better. So I hope that kind of gives you some idea about how to think about that. But yeah, that's Saturn. Awesome question. So we have about 15 minutes left or so. Any final questions? Last call. I'm going to pick another topic. I kind of wanted to talk about like water, like the element of water. I also had kind of a cute kind of Mars Venus thing. Let me see here. Oh, no, I didn't look up her chart. So I watched this TED Talk about Civil War by this person named Barbara F. Walters. And I'm just going to share my whole screen with y'all. So this lady here, TED Talk, Barbara Walter, not Barbara Walters, Barbara F. Walter, Civil Wars expert. And this was an interesting talk. But that aside, I liked what it said about her. It said, Barbara F. Walters' love of peace led her to become an expert in civil wars, the conflicts that last the longest and are the hardest to resolve. And I was like, wow. And I read this a few days after Mars went into Libra. And I was thinking, this is the most Mars and Libra shit I have ever heard. Love for peace leading someone to become an expert in civil wars. So that was my first thought. And so I went forth and I looked up her chart. So I'm going to grab that 1 second. I did. I pulled it up here, I think. Because this lady does not have, it's not Mars and Libra. So while I'm pulling this up, think about other combinations, like other planet or like two planets together or planet and sign that could also describe someone who is interested in peace and so learns about war or something like that. What other astrological combinations might make that? Sweet, I did. Okay, there she is. Here it is. This is what it was. It wasn't Mars in Libra, but it was Mars conjunct Venus, but it was in Cancer. And I was like, oh yeah, Civil War. Civil wars are wars with people that were supposed to be a unified family. They're supposed to be a thing. And so I was like, oh, wow. So we get this notion of Venusian and martial concepts coming together in this Civil War expert. And P.S., I don't know her rising. This is an X-rated birth time. I just have the day. It's August 30th, 1964, Bronxville, New York. And I just set it to 12 p.m. just because. But yeah, Civil War expert, Mars conjunct Venus in Cancer. So I thought that was a pretty great example. But yeah, a lot of, Mars and Venus energy come together, and a lot of those things get pretty interesting and complicated in how they can come out. Just blew my mind. Adam asks, would you recommend primary sources like the recent Chris Brennan publication of Valens? Oh, heck yes, absolutely. So, after kind of those first 4 options I mentioned of like very first book, then, like any lineage tradition, we have to start going back and, well, who said that? Well, who told them? Well, who told them? And that's the really nice thing too about both Chris Brennan and Demetra George. They just give you kind of all of the kind of, I guess, curriculum of source texts that you would need to just keep going back and back and back and back and back. So yeah, the recent Mark Riley translation is awesome. Highly recommend if you're ready for that. And I mean, it would be a good, it would be a fine, I don't know if it'd be good. I mean, it would be a fine first book, but like, I don't know. I just think about someone new to astrology reading Valens's description of Mars, and I think it might turn him off. I think we need to prepare people a little bit more for what they're about to read in Valens, if that makes sense. So maybe not my first pick for a new person, but definitely highly recommended. Okay. Cool. I'm happy I brought up that lady. And then I wanted to talk about, let's just end it talking about malefic and benefic and what those words mean. Ever since Mars got into Libra, I have just been feisty. I've been intellectually feisty and wanted to just argue about everything. So I haven't, but I have written a few angry essays. And one of them was prompted because I heard an astrologer talking about how they basically don't like these designations that come from ancient astrology, which are translations of not English words, benefic and malefic from ancient astrology. They don't like these words. And their reasons for not liking these words were really reasonable. Kind of righteous anger about like, the harm done to clients when we don't prepare people and we're like, you got some idiot who shouldn't be reading yet, who's saying things like, oh, you have a malefic on your Venus or something. Like that doesn't sound good. Venus is love. I don't want a malefic on my Venus. Like, and then they don't explain themselves if they use those words, or they just say cryptic things, or they leave people kind of hanging, just having heard these really kind of, and they are like strong. That's a strong word. Malefic, very strong word. Benefic, very strong word. So I wanted to kind of just break this down a little bit for anybody who is not clear on what these words are about and what this whole chestnut is, because I do think there's a problem in here that other astrologer was right on point about, in that, these are not just words that you can run into a consult with and do so without some kind of care. If you're going to, ideally, we wouldn't be using those technical terms at all. And I generally do not, unless I am talking to someone who tells me they are a student of astrology and is already talking the language. Because then I know, like, if you've been on Twitter for 2 seconds, you're going to run into those words, and so when people know, then it's my job to educate. When people don't know those words, it is my job to just not go there, because it's totally unnecessary if we are able to use, English or whatever our language is that's not astrology's. There's so many good discussions in there too. But anyway, so malefic, benefic, we have to have, life in all of its complexity, all of it. We have to have things that describe and reflect the favorable events and the unfavorable events. We have to have planets that describe difficulties as well as easeful things, because that is the nature of life. If we ignore either, then we are not being honest, really. And I think that, that kind of discussion in astrology has been pretty pretty chill lately, like this notion of like how Pollyanna are we being, or how negative are we being? Of course we want to take a middle road. We don't want to be too much of either. And that's the tough thing about astrology, is reading it in such a way that we have the most realistic perception of what we're reading, which is, it's impossible to be totally correct and objective, but we can try. Anyway, I digress. So we need planets to describe this unfavorable stuff. That is true. Malefics, yeah, they describe things that are not fun in life. Saturn describes loss. Mars describes pain. We also know that Saturn, these are package deals, coin with two sides. Mars is also motivation. Saturn is also discipline. Do people think discipline is comfortable? No. Do people think effort is comfortable? Not usually. So like a lot of the things that we would maybe want to just, and of course we're trying to supplant our little ideas of what's morally good, or what we think is favorable, which could be entirely different than what someone else thinks, which is a whole another fucking thing. But in any event, okay, we've got planets that describe good things and bad things. We've also got planets that describe unfavorable, favorable things. We've got planets that describe things that are maybe comfortable or uncomfortable. But then things like motivation and discipline that are very neutral and aren't good or bad or anything like that. So there's no moral, judgment on what discipline is, or anything that Saturn says about that. Okay, so here's the part that I think everybody misses. This is the part that astrologer missed. And I think a lot of people would be a lot less angry if they knew this. And also, I think as a reading astrologer, this is a way that you can present malefic and benefic to help people not be scared of it in agricultural weather terms. So all these folks were farmers, right? Like so many people were farmers. So this idea of malefic being extreme conditions and benefic being temperate conditions. Malefic being Mars, extreme dry, Saturn, extreme dry, Mars, extremely hot. And then we've got temperate planets that are moist and more stable. They're the stable conditions for growth, Jupiter and Venus. And in general, most people feel like those are pretty favorable things. If we're growing, if we feel nourished, if we feel moist and satiated, like we're feeling pretty good. If we're too dry, if we're too hot, if things are extreme, it generally doesn't feel as good. That's our human perception though. And at the same time, extreme conditions are 100% necessary sometimes. Sometimes we need like extreme dry to dry something out that's too wet. Sometimes these things are very useful. Even Mars, being that severing influence, that's pretty extreme. Like cutting one thing into two things, that is very extreme, right? Like just saying. So I like to think about the malefics and benefics in that more material world, agricultural weather type of way, because then it can help us separate and get away from this tendency we all have to try to morally or otherwise preferentially say, oh, that's good and that's bad, or that's going to be comfortable and that's going to be uncomfortable. Like we can get away from all that stuff entirely and just think about it like what is stable and what is unstable, like very much that. So that is thing one on that topic of just like, what is malefic and benefic? What does it mean? So we're just all clear on that, because I think there's a lot of people that miss the second part and they get so like just hooked on this notion that, if we tell someone about Saturn, they're going to be traumatized or something. And it's like, no, it's more nuanced and complicated than that. And I also think it's kind of offensive to ancient people to think that they weren't nuanced like that. Just saying that Mars is clearly in Libra. Last thing about that though, because, okay, so there was something there though about, what do we do when we're talking about this with people? Because even if we're like astrology enthusiasts, astrology students, and we're out there in the world and we get excited and we're at a dinner party and we're talking about astrology, hopefully not. Well, it depends on who you're with. Like when we're just out here talking about this stuff too. And granted, I'm a Capricorn. So I'm very much like I want to be a steward of this profession, and I want people, to kind of put our best foot forward, I guess, as astrologers. Just, be aware of when you're using these words and who you're using them with. And if they're going to, if you're good at reading people a little bit, you can kind of tell, like, how big is their threat assessment here? Are they going to run off with this and be super, traumatized by hearing that they have a malefic in their first house, or something like that? So just like have your wits about you, like meet people where they are. Like that would be kind of step one. Step two is, the education piece, where we go from, okay, I want to use plain language as much as possible, but kind of like when you're in therapy and the therapist will do psychoeducation and be like, oh, hey, do you know what, this is? And you'll be like, oh, no, I've never heard of that before, but thanks, because now I have words for it. That's psychoeducation. We can do that as astrologers and astrology students as well, is just like, if there is a sense that it needs to be explained, it probably does need to be explained. Maybe if you tell someone's going to be nervous about something, and that's when you would explain and be like, okay, so we'll listen. Like, and it doesn't take that long. And I don't think people need to be that smart to pick this up. Like you can literally say, ancient people were very agricultural. And so they thought of these planets in terms of stability and instability. Simple as that. And that's not necessarily good or bad. And we don't know how these things are going to turn out necessarily. So always having that kind of in your back pocket. So it's like, we need to be better at talking about it. Like, I want to give that point to the person who is mad about these words. We do need to be better at talking about it. We need to be better at reading the room. We need to not throw this language around in consults with people if we know that it's going to freak them out. And that's something you learn as you go as well, is just what things are helpful or not to say. But yeah, and also, as astrologers who aren't, maybe Hellenistic, I don't expect them to know these things, just like how I don't understand how to read intercepted houses. Like, I'm not going to expect people to know the concepts that I'm more familiar with. At the same point, like, I know enough to say I don't know how to read intercepted houses. Like, I'm not going to go around being like they're the worst, we shouldn't do intercepted houses, when I like clearly don't understand it. So that rant is over just in time. Does anyone have any final concerns, questions, queries? Final call. And then I'm going to look for a nice transit. Do we have a nice transit coming up? Let's look. We just had a nice little benefic enclosure the other day when the moon was in Leo. That was great. Oh yeah, I'm kind of curious. So this was a day that I was talking about a bit on my forecast. September 18th and 19th. We have the moon in Scorpio, which usually I wouldn't pick as a day. I feel like I'm gambling a little bit. But last month I observed the moon in Scorpio, and I was curious about how it was going to be, with the two benefics interacting with the moon, giving the moon stability, giving the moon support. And it was kind of a good day. It was a very generative, creative day. I watched someone who they just wrote music all day that they were really passionate about. So that was very like moon and Scorpio. It's like getting really focused and like, I'm going to do this thing. That was very much the vibe. So I'm kind of curious if this one here on September 18th, 19th, when we again have the support and the stabilizing power of the benefics here, if that might not be kind of an interesting day. Maybe we could, if you've got a passion project you're working on the 18th or 19th, might be some good days to work on it. If you're trying to get to the bottom of something or investigate something, anything to do with the Scorpio part of your chart, if you're just trying to work with those themes or topics. So this is my 10th house. So I'll be doing career-y stuff probably, or, creating content or something like that. But yeah, I'm kind of looking forward to it a little bit. I think I'll leave it at that. I think that's a good place to leave it on. So don't leave it on a prickly note. Ba-bum. Thank you, Danny, and thank you, Fallen. I appreciate you both. I appreciate all of you. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you in a month. But before that, I did actually I'm somewhat on top of it. My next thing I have already scheduled, October 27th at noon Central Standard Time, 12 p.m. Central Time. I am going to do the forecast for October. That is live, but also, of course, recorded, so you don't have to be there. But join me on Wednesday at noon Central Time, October 27th, or sorry, September 27th for the October forecast. So it's about 2 weeks from now. And, cliff notes for October. We got 2 eclipses. We got 2 Hellenistic grade void of course moons that last like 3 days apiece. So those are like main things we're going to be talking about. Yeah, very interesting month. It's going to be very, very interesting, very much worth showing up for. Other than that, I don't have anything else planned. If you are part of Chris Brennan's Hellenistic Astrology course, we have been meeting to read that book on Chris's book, The Study of Fate and Fortune. And we've been doing that the first Saturday of the month. So let me just, first Saturday of the month. I don't think we've put out the link for it yet. So if you're on that student group on Facebook, the Hellenistic Astrology course Facebook group, that's where we're going to be announcing those things. We've only done chapter 1. You can join anytime. It does not matter. So if you want to jump in at any chapter, that's cool. We're going to be starting chapter 2 in October. So, and that'll be a 2-parter. So don't, it's because it's a big one. So we're going to separate chapter 2 over October and November. Other than that, I am doing readings. I'm currently working on a writing piece about empty houses and how to treat empty houses. So that's very exciting. Yeah, just living the dream, doing readings, book a reading. Please use the discount code Astrology Podcast when you book with me for 10% off. And other than that, I think that's it. Yeah. So thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have an excellent evening. Hope you have an excellent month. I'll see you again next month, second Thursday, same bat place, same bat channel, 7 p.m. Central Time. I am Dr. Claire Moon, and